We're writing for a path to reconciliation that all future governments are going to be required to take a look at seriously.
94 recommendations. Time for a reality check. I'm Brian Lilley with TheRebel.media. It's been an important week in Ottawa. Ceremonies, the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, more ceremonies, lots of sharing, lots of talking, and lots of drumming as well. I don't understand everything that's going on with the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the ceremonies. I don't get why some actions, some things are given such great importance. But then again, I can't begin to understand the horrors of the residential school system. That system of residential schools harmed untold numbers. That's a fact that can't be denied. There are many people with scars left behind. I've spoken to the survivors. I've heard their stories firsthand. The schools were the benevolent act of the best progressive thinking of the day. All the experts of the era said this was the right thing to do. Once again, listening to experts on how to live our lives, how our children should be raised, how they should be educated, well, turned out to be wrong. The events in Ottawa this week, they're the culmination of years of negotiation, years of hard work. It all goes back to the historic apology Prime Minister Stephen Harper delivered in the House of Commons in 2008. I just want to point out that the PM issued the apology. Prime Minister Harper, no Liberal Prime Minister had ever done that. He set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and yet he gets slagged by leaders of the Aboriginal movement regularly for not doing enough. I don't want to turn this into a political, partisan issue, but others already have, so here it goes. It wasn't the Conservatives that brought Canada the Indian Act or the residential schools. That was the Liberal government of Alexander Mackenzie. It wasn't Conservatives that have been in power for most of the last 100 years that were the party in power responsible for most of the governing of that time during the ongoing residential school system. That would be the Liberals, and yet the animosity directed at the Conservatives is palpable. Better to say the right thing, I suppose, than do the right thing, which is why, well, Justin Trudeau gets applause when he's promising something like this.
The Commission issued 94 recommendations to advance the process to close the quality of life gaps that exist. The Liberal Party today accepts and commits to implement these recommendations. Will the Prime Minister stand in this place and do the same?
Now, the Harper government has not promised to enact all 94 recommendations, but neither have the NDP. As one New Democrat put it to me, quite wisely, no federal government could actually enact all 94 recommendations. Some of the recommendations call for actions by the provinces, and the feds can't make policy for the provinces. There's recommendations for independent groups like law societies or corporations to do things. The feds can't make them do that. Trudeau's promising on something he can't deliver, but it makes him sound like he cares, so he does it. The media coverage on TV anyway was at best superficial. What I saw were people talking about the recommendations, or some of them anyway, without casting a critical eye.
What is the test for reconciliation?
Well, I think one of the tests for reconciliation will be implementation of the 94 recommendations.
The recommendations to counter the damning legacy of residential schools.
There's nearly 100 recommendations.
Here are some of the 94 recommendations.
94 recommendations.
And 94 recommendations.
94 changes.
Declare a statutory holiday.
Statutory holiday.
Calls for an apology from the Pope within a year in Canada.
A papal apology.
In Canada within the next year.
The mandatory curriculum from elementary to high school.
Kindergarten to grade 12.
Mandatory curriculum.
Right up to university and media too. I mean, am I reading that correctly?
Yes. A national watchdog agency.
Monuments in every province.
State of Aboriginal Peoples report delivered by the Prime Minister every single year.
Create a National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
Create a National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
There's even a CBC recommendation in there for additional dollars for CBC programming.
An excellent report.
So what of the recommendations? You've heard of some of them, at least headlines of some of them, and let's face it, some of them do make sense. This is a report on the horrors of a residential school system run by the federal government and churches, and the feds are responsible for Native education. So it makes sense that there's going to be a lot of recommendations on education. But what else is in there? Well, there's this, Recommendation 6. We call upon the Government of Canada to repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code of Canada. Section 43 of the Criminal Code is the protection of parents against criminal prosecution for using force to correct the child. That doesn't protect people that beat children. Let me make that clear. That's not what this law does, but it does allow spanking within limits. Why is that in this report? I know that many kids were beaten in residential schools, that teachers used to rely on that section as well. That's no longer the case, and corporal punishment is not allowed in most schools today. This doesn't belong in this report. Parliament has voted down several attempts to change this, and they should do so again. So recommendation 6 should be ignored. As I've correctly pointed out before, eliminating that section of the criminal code would make the parent of a 2-year-old throwing a violent temper tantrum guilty of assault if they just picked up the child and strapped them into their car seat because it's time to leave the park. I can't do that to you, another adult, and the law would consider it assault if I did it to a 2-year-old if they get rid of Section 43. What else is in this report? Well, Justice Murray Sinclair, the lead commissioner, spends a lot of time calling for nation-to-nation relationships. He said that on CTV, and he also said that the dependency needs to end.
If a government believes that Aboriginal people should continue to be in a dependent state, no different than any other minority group in society, then that's going to be problematic for reconciliation. If there's a statement that is a broader nation-to-nation kind of relationship, such as it is in the United States and elsewhere, then we think that's got some room for discussion and dialogue.
Now here's a question. If you want a nation-to-nation relationship with Canada, why are there repeated calls for more money from the government of Canada? There's all this talk about sovereignty and respect. Well, that's a bit like my kids claiming they're independent and then hitting me up for more money because they ain't got none. One of the things that they want funded out of the many calls for more funding is spelled out in Recommendation 15. We call upon the federal government to appoint, in consultation with Aboriginal groups, an Aboriginal Languages Commissioner. The Commissioner should help promote Aboriginal languages and report on the adequacy of federal funding of Aboriginal language initiatives. Well, we see how well that goes with the Official Languages Commissioner, or as I call him, the Commissioner for Expanding French Everywhere. Are we going to end up with reports on how Cree isn't being respected in the federal workplace, demands for people to be supervised in Cree or another language? This is going to divide people, not bring them together. I'm all for people keeping their language, but that recommendation, if enacted, will lead to a government agency that will grow and grow and grow and cost billions. As I've said, there's lots in there calling for other groups or government agencies to do more as well, things the feds can't impose. Such as 16, we call upon post-secondary institutions to create university and college degree and diploma programs in Aboriginal languages. That's not something the feds can do. 24, we call upon medical and nursing schools in Canada to require all students to take courses dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights and Indigenous teachings and practices. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. 27. We call upon the Federation of Law Societies of Canada to ensure that lawyers receive appropriate cultural competency training, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. There are also calls for companies to bring in educational programs on residential schools and the UN Declaration into the workplace. Now, I think that is more than a bit much. A business owner can do that if they want, but I wouldn't want that in my workplace. But CBC pundit Ian Capstick was singing the praises of the idea.
As a business owner, there's even things in there that are directed towards Canada's private corporations.
Sure.
So, our business will make that firm commitment today and encourage others to do the same thing, to bring this education, not just into an educational setting, but into a corporate setting where so many people continue to learn every day.
Just to note, Ian's company, Media Style, which specializes in training left-wing and progressive causes and groups, supplied the media team to handle the TRC's rollout in Ottawa this week. He can bring that into his workplace if he wants. I won't be doing it. And none of these recommendations can be carried out by the federal government. Doesn't matter what Justin Trudeau wishes. As for this constant referral to the United Nations Declaration, this is an attempt to make UN law, international law, supersede Canadian law, to tie the hands of Parliament to rules and regulations passed by an unelected body that gives as much weight to the views of a dictator as it does to the views of Canada. Just a couple more points. They want fewer Aboriginal people in jail. Recommendation 30. We call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody over the next decade, and to issue detailed annual reports that monitor and evaluate progress in doing so. Why are they in jail? There are already rules that say sentences for Aboriginals have to be lower than those of non-Aboriginals. And I get that there's a lot of problems on reserves, but that is not an excuse for breaking the law. My mother came out of a crime-ridden slum. No one in her family was in jail. They all worked hard to get out of that place. There may be underlying issues leading to more crime, but that can't be solved by letting people walk. Recommendation 30 is the wrong answer to the wrong problem. And finally, they want more money for CBC. That's right. A report on how to heal after the residential schools issue says put more money into the state broadcaster. Recommendation 84. We call upon the federal government to restore and increase funding to CBC Radio Canada to enable Canada's national public broadcaster to support reconciliation and be properly reflective of the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples. They go on to call for more jobs for Aboriginal people at CBC. This report could have been so much more. There is healing that needs to be done. I can't imagine what it's like to have gone through the system, to have your children ripped away from you, or to go yourself. And our country perpetrated that system of residential schools. So I understand the need for apologies and reparations and, yes, even change. But so much of this is simply a list of left-wing political demands. This isn't about healing. This is about political agenda in far too many instances. I'm not saying that the entire report is bad, but doing as Justin Trudeau's done, doing as so many in the media have done, and just saying, let's enact all 94 recommendations would be the wrong course of action. It would be wrong for the Aboriginal, the residential school survivors. It would be wrong for the Aboriginal community in Canada as a whole, and it would be wrong for the country as a whole. Better to take time for reflection and enact real, meaningful change than simply go along so that it seems like you're doing or saying the right thing instead of doing the right thing.